Welcome to my channel, The Good Book Tales. Today we step into the final, haunting days of a man whose wisdom was unmatched, whose wealth was legendary, and whose story has fascinated generations. King Solomon. Imagine a king who could solve impossible disputes, who built a temple so magnificent that it shimmered like the heavens themselves, and yet, in the shadows of all his glory, faced a fate that no crown, treasure, or wisdom could prevent. This is the story of the tragic end of King Solomon, the wisest king the world has ever known. For decades, Solomon ruled with unparalleled wisdom. People came from distant lands, not just to witness the grandeur of his kingdom, but to hear his judgments, which were so fair and precise that they seemed almost divine. Yet behind the splendor of golden palaces and endless riches, cracks were forming in the foundation of his reign. Alliances that once strengthened his kingdom were now fraying. His heart, once guided by clarity and purpose, began to wrestle with temptations and choices that would shape the final chapter of his life. As we explore the last days of Solomon, we'll uncover a man who, despite his unmatched intelligence, was deeply human. He faced dilemmas that wisdom alone could not untangle. Family rivalries, political tensions, and the pull of desires that conflicted with his sacred duties started to shadow his legacy. How could the wisest of kings, the man who could discern truth from lies with uncanny precision, find himself teetering on the edge of ruin? That's the mystery we're about to unravel. The story of Solomon's final days is not just about a king losing his grip on power. It's a tale of the fragility of human strength, the consequences of choices, and the haunting reality that even the greatest minds cannot escape the passage of time. From secret betrayals in the court to quiet moments of regret in the solitude of his chambers, Solomon's journey toward the end of his reign is a study in contrast. Glory versus downfall, wisdom versus folly, light versus darkness. And yet, as the sun set on the kingdom of Israel, whispers of rebellion, discontent, and the strains of a fractured kingdom began to echo through the palace halls. What exactly led to the unraveling of Solomon's golden reign? Was it betrayal from those he trusted most, or a failure of the very wisdom that made him famous? The answers are hidden in the shadows of history, and today we'll follow the trail to uncover the shocking twists of his last days. Stay with me as we journey through the untold story of King Solomon's final moments. Moments filled with tension, regret, and choices that would echo for centuries. By the end of this video, you may find yourself questioning everything you thought you knew about the wisest king in history. But beware, this story doesn't end here. The final chapter of Solomon's life is as unpredictable as it is tragic, and in just a moment, we'll dive into the events that set the stage for his ultimate downfall. The story of King Solomon's final days cannot be told without understanding the kingdom he inherited and the legacy he carried. Solomon, son of David, rose to power at a time when Israel was at its peak. Strong, prosperous, and admired by surrounding nations. He inherited not only a throne, but also the weight of expectations. To maintain peace, to honor God, and to guide his people with the wisdom that had become his hallmark. For years, he did just that. His judgments were studied and praised, his building projects awe-inspiring, and his diplomacy unmatched. Visitors traveled from far and wide, seeking counsel, alliances, and the marvels of a kingdom bathed in wealth and culture. But even the brightest light can cast the deepest shadows. Despite his wisdom, Solomon was human, and his human desires began to complicate the kingdom he had worked so hard to strengthen. Historical whispers tell of a king drawn into alliances and marriages that, while politically advantageous, tested his loyalty and judgment. These relationships were more than mere partnerships. They carried influence, secrets, and pressure that slowly chipped away at the clarity that had once defined him. It was in these quiet cracks, the hidden corners of palace life, that the seeds of his decline were sown. At the heart of Solomon's story is not only his brilliance, but the tension between his responsibilities and his personal desires. He was a man torn between his devotion to God and the temptations of power and wealth. Every decision he made, from the construction of the great temple to the arrangement of alliances through marriage, had consequences. And as the years passed, whispers of dissatisfaction grew louder. Ministers, generals, and even members of his own family began to question the path he was taking. Small cracks in loyalty and trust, almost invisible at first, became threatening fractures. And then there were the quiet, human moments. The nights when Solomon walked alone through the echoing halls of his palace, the weight of his decisions pressing on him, wondering if the wisdom that had brought him fame could also save him from the unraveling he sensed around him. His story is not merely about grandeur or judgment. It is a story of choices, temptations, and the delicate balance between ambition and morality. As tension simmered in the palace, the stage was set for events that would challenge the very foundations of Solomon's kingdom. Allies and enemies alike moved in ways that would soon change the course of history. The questions hung in the air. Could Solomon navigate the growing storm? Or would the same brilliance that built his legacy also be the architect of its downfall? In the next part, we'll step closer into the heart of the conflict, revealing the critical moments and secret decisions that marked the beginning of the end for the wisest king in history. As Solomon's reign approached its later years, the challenges he faced became increasingly complex. What had once seemed like minor disagreements or rivalries in the palace began to grow into a web of tension and intrigue. Advisors who had once offered guidance now questioned his decisions, sometimes quietly, sometimes openly. Even those closest to him, family members and trusted ministers, began to act with their own ambitions in mind, testing the king's patience and judgment. The court that had once reflected order and wisdom now hummed with whispers of doubt and dissent. One of the most troubling conflicts came from within Solomon's own household. His many marriages, intended to strengthen alliances with neighboring kingdoms, created not only political ties, but also tensions and divided loyalties. Queens and concubines brought influence from their homelands, sometimes swaying the king in ways that conflicted with his original vision for the kingdom. The delicate balance between personal desire and duty began to tilt, and with it, the certainty of Solomon's rule seemed to waver. Beyond the palace walls, the people and neighboring nations watched closely. What once had been a unified and prosperous Israel now showed subtle signs of unrest. Governors of distant provinces grew restless, questioning the king's judgments and his commitment to justice. Rumors of rebellion began to spread quietly, carried by travelers and merchants, seeping into the ears of those who had long trusted the wisdom of their ruler. Every decision Solomon made now carried weight, not just for his legacy, but for the very survival of the kingdom he had built. Meanwhile, the king himself wrestled with his conscience. Could his legendary wisdom navigate the growing shadows of envy, ambition, and temptation? Could he preserve his kingdom from both internal and external threats? Or was he already trapped in a path from which there was no turning back? The threads of loyalty, betrayal, and personal struggle intertwined in ways that no one, not even Solomon, could fully predict, leaving the kingdom teetering on the edge of uncertainty. The palace corridors, once filled with the steady rhythm of order and authority, now echoed with tension. Every whispered conversation, every careful glance, seemed loaded with hidden meaning. Solomon, the wisest king in history, felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down like a shadow that refused to lift. Decisions that once flowed easily now came with hesitation, each choice carrying the potential to ignite unrest, both inside and beyond the palace walls. Even the advisors he had trusted for decades began to hesitate, some out of fear, others out of their own quiet ambitions. In the outer provinces, the murmurs of discontent grew louder. Governors and officials began to challenge decrees, testing the limits of loyalty. Merchants and travelers spoke in hushed tones of unrest, and in the streets of Jerusalem, ordinary citizens whispered questions about their king's judgment. Was the wisdom that had guided Solomon still intact, or had time and temptation weakened the clarity that once defined him? The tension was no longer just political. It had become personal, a reflection of the king's inner struggle between duty, desire, and the moral compass that had once been his guiding light. Within the palace, the fractures deepened. Family disputes simmered just beneath the surface, alliances shifted quietly, and even the most loyal ministers began to wonder which way the tides would turn. Solomon, ever aware of the precarious balance, walked through his golden halls at night, contemplating the choices that had brought him here. Each step felt heavier than the last, every decision a potential spark that could ignite the powder keg of unrest around him. And as the sun set over the kingdom, a sense of impending crisis hung in the air. The stage was set for confrontation, the tension reaching a point where it could no longer be contained. Loyalties would be tested, secrets revealed, and the consequences of every choice would begin to unfold. The kingdom teetered on the brink, and Solomon, despite his wisdom, could feel the storm approaching, a storm that promised to reshape his reign and leave a mark that would echo through history. Even more unsettling were the rumors that reached Solomon about some of his closest allies. Advisors who had been with him since the early days of his reign were now suspected of secret dealings, negotiating behind the king's back with those who sought to undermine his rule. Solomon, who had always prided himself on seeing through deception, now found himself questioning the loyalty of those he had trusted the most. Each conversation, each gesture, carried layers of hidden meaning, forcing the king to rely not only on his wisdom, but on intuition. And even that seemed clouded by the uncertainty swirling around him. Meanwhile, tensions within Solomon's household began to escalate. The alliances formed through his marriages, which had once seemed a source of strength, were now threatening to pull the royal family in opposing directions. Some queens openly expressed loyalty to distant lands rather than to the kingdom itself, while others whispered to their children, planting seeds of ambition and dissent. The palace, once a symbol of unity and power, had become a labyrinth of intrigue where every corner seemed to hold a potential betrayal. As these external and internal pressures converged, Solomon felt the weight of his own mortality pressing closer. The brilliant king, who had once solved disputes with remarkable clarity, now faced conflicts that seemed beyond reason or logic. Every decision carried the potential to ignite rebellion, fracture loyalty, or destroy the delicate balance he had fought so hard to maintain. And as night fell over Jerusalem, an ominous sense of inevitability settled in. The storm that had been gathering in silence for years was now breaking, and the question on everyone's mind, inside and outside the palace, was whether Solomon could navigate the chaos he had not seen coming, or whether even the wisest king in history was about to face an ending none could have foreseen. The kingdom teetered on the brink of chaos, and with each passing hour, the tension grew. Hidden alliances, secret ambitions, and the consequences of every choice made in the past now collided, threatening to redefine not just the fate of Solomon, but the future of all Israel. The stage was set, and the coming moments would push the king and his kingdom to the limits of endurance, intelligence, and survival. As the tension reached its breaking point, Solomon stood at the center of his throne room, the golden walls around him reflecting not just the light of countless torches, but the weight of a kingdom on the verge of collapse. The conspiracies, the whispers of betrayal, and the unrest that had simmered for years now demanded action. Solomon, the wisest king in history, could no longer rely on his intuition alone. He had to act decisively. Summoning his advisors, family members, and loyal generals, he began to address the fractures that threatened to destroy all he had built. The confrontation was unlike any Solomon had faced before. Governors who had conspired against him were brought to the palace, their schemes laid bare. Solomon's wisdom, honed over decades, allowed him to untangle the web of deception with remarkable precision. He exposed the hidden ambitions, the secret alliances, and the quiet betrayals, forcing each conspirator to face the consequences of their actions. Loyalty and truth became the currency of survival, and one by one the threats were neutralized. Even within his household, Solomon's insight and firm judgment restored order, reminding everyone that his mind, though tested, remained unmatched. Yet, just as the kingdom seemed to stabilize, an unexpected twist struck. News arrived of a distant betrayal that no one had anticipated. An act not of rebellion, but of tragedy. One of Solomon's closest allies, a general who had stood by him through countless challenges, had fallen victim to an accident that threatened the kingdom's security at the very moment stability was returning. This unforeseen event forced Solomon to confront the harsh reality that even wisdom and preparation could not shield him from the unpredictable hand of fate. The king, seasoned and prudent, recognized that his reign would always involve uncertainty, and that the human element, the fragility of life, loyalty, and chance, was a force beyond calculation. As the dust settled in the palace, Solomon stood alone in the quiet of the grand hall, reflecting on the lessons of his final days. He had faced betrayal, unrest, and temptation, and had navigated the storm with the clarity that had once defined him. But the unexpected loss reminded him, and the kingdom, that no matter how wise a ruler may be, the future is never entirely within human control. The kingdom survived, yet the shadow of unpredictability lingered. Solomon's legacy, brilliant and enduring, would be remembered not just for the wisdom he demonstrated in resolving conflict, but for the humility and vigilance required to face the unexpected, even at the height of power. And as the candles flickered in the palace, a quiet question remained. What other forces, unseen and unimagined, might still shape the fate of Israel long after the wisest king had walked these halls? In the days that followed the storm, Solomon worked quietly to restore a sense of balance to his kingdom. The palace, once tense with whispers and hidden agendas, slowly regained its rhythm. Advisors who had proven their loyalty were rewarded, and even those who had faltered were given opportunities to redeem themselves under the careful guidance of a king who understood that wisdom often required patience and forgiveness. The people of Israel, who had watched the palace unrest with growing unease, began to feel the reassurance of stability returning. Markets thrived again, governors pledged their allegiance, and the distant provinces sent word of renewed loyalty. Solomon himself walked the corridors of the temple and the palace, reflecting on the lessons of these final days. He had learned, more profoundly than ever, that wisdom is not just the ability to judge fairly or solve problems, but the courage to face uncertainty and adapt when the world shifts in ways that even the wisest mind cannot predict. The struggles, the conspiracies, and the unexpected tragedies had tested not only his intellect, but his humanity, and he emerged with a deeper understanding of both. The family disputes that had threatened to divide the palace were resolved through careful counsel and open communication. Relationships that had been strained by ambition and jealousy were gradually repaired, not through force, but through understanding and the acknowledgement of shared responsibility for the kingdom's future. Even the alliances formed through Solomon's marriages, once a source of tension, began to stabilize as he balanced diplomacy with fairness, showing that true leadership requires both wisdom and empathy. And yet, the story of Solomon's final days left a quiet, lingering truth. No matter how great a king, no matter how vast a kingdom, human life and the course of events are never entirely under control. The unexpected twists and challenges he faced were reminders that every decision carries consequences, and that even the wisest must navigate uncertainty with humility. As the sun set over Jerusalem, casting golden light across the temple and the palace, Solomon stood on the balcony, looking over the city he had worked so hard to build and protect. The kingdom was safe, the conspiracies quelled, and the lessons of his reign clearer than ever. His legacy would endure not just for the wisdom he displayed, but for the resilience, foresight, and humanity he showed in the face of adversity. And though the final chapter of his life had brought trials and heartbreak, it also left behind a kingdom strengthened by experience, a people inspired by wisdom, and a story that would echo through generations. The tale of the wisest king, his triumphs, and his trials would never be forgotten.